Hello, dear listeners. Welcome to today's episode here on the English Globe. We're diving deep into one of the most fascinating and complex relationships in Asian history, China and Japan. Before we begin, we'd love for you to support our work. Please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and let us know in the comments where you're listening from. Share your opinions on today's topic. We're always eager to hear your thoughts. Your feedback truly helps us shape future episodes.
That's right, Adam. The story of China and Japan is not just about borders or politics. It's about thousands of years of interaction, influence, rivalry, and occasional alliance. This relationship has shaped the history of East Asia in ways that still affect our world today. When we look at the long arc of history, we see patterns of deep cultural borrowing alongside moments of sharp conflict, each leaving its mark on both societies.
To understand their rivalry and cooperation, we need to step back and imagine the East Asian world of ancient times. China was one of the earliest and most advanced civilizations, with a sophisticated writing system, centralized governance, and a rich philosophical tradition. Japan, across the sea, was still developing its state structure, but was close enough to absorb influences from the Chinese mainland, often via the Korean peninsula. Geography made them neighbors, history made them both students and competitors.
In the early centuries, China's political and cultural influence spread across the region through trade, diplomacy, and sometimes military expansion. Japan, especially during the Yamato period, actively sought knowledge from China. Envoys were sent to learn about Chinese governance, architecture, and even urban planning. These early contacts were largely peaceful, driven by Japan's desire to strengthen its own systems by learning from a powerful neighbor. It was a time of borrowing, adaptation, and growth.
One of the most significant cultural imports was the Chinese writing system. Before this, Japan had no formal method for recording language. The adoption of Chinese characters, known as kanji, revolutionized Japanese administration, literature, and education. Alongside writing came the introduction of Buddhism, which traveled from India through China and Korea before reaching Japan. Temples, rituals, and philosophical ideas transformed Japanese society, blending with local traditions.
But this influence wasn't just one way. Japan took what it learned and adapted it to its own needs. Chinese Confucian principles shaped Japanese governance, but the Japanese integrated them into their existing clan-based power structures. Buddhism took on distinctly Japanese forms, blending with Shinto beliefs. The result was a unique cultural synthesis, deeply influenced by China, yet unmistakably Japanese. This dynamic of borrowing and reshaping would define much of their early relationship.
We should also note that cultural exchange often went hand in hand with diplomacy. The tribute system, used by China to manage relations with its neighbors, allowed Japan to send official missions in exchange for trade privileges and recognition. These missions were as much about learning and networking as they were about politics. They symbolized Japan's acknowledgement of China's regional authority, though in practice, Japan often maintained more independence than other tributary states.
However, even in these early centuries, seeds of rivalry were present. Both nations were aware of their unique identities and ambitions. Maritime trade routes in the East China Sea were crucial for wealth and resources, and competition for control sometimes created tension. While open warfare was rare in these early periods, the underlying awareness of each other's power was always there, shaping diplomacy and strategy.
By looking at this early stage, we can already see the pattern. Cultural borrowing mixed with strategic caution. China saw Japan as a distant yet important neighbor, sometimes a pupil, sometimes a challenge. Japan respected China's advancements, but was determined to remain distinct and self-reliant. This balance between admiration and independence is key to understanding how their relationship evolved over the centuries.
In the centuries ahead, this dynamic would be tested repeatedly. Periods of peace and mutual benefit would give way to moments of mistrust and competition. The relationship between China and Japan was never static. It was constantly shaped by changing political landscapes, economic needs, and shifts in regional power. The roots of both their rivalry and their alliances were planted in these early exchanges, and they would grow in complexity over time.
Today, when we discuss East Asian geopolitics, we are really seeing the latest chapter of a story that began more than 1,000 years ago. Ancient diplomacy, cultural adaptation, and maritime trade all set the stage for the events that would follow. By understanding the foundation, we can better grasp why this relationship remains so significant. History is not just the past, it's the key to decoding the present.
And that's why in the coming sections, we'll trace this story from its beginnings to the modern day, examining how cooperation and conflict have shaped two of the most influential nations in the world. We'll see how ideas, religion, language, and trade bound them together, even as politics and ambition pushed them apart. It's a journey through time that reveals as much about human nature as it does about regional power.
So, dear listeners, as we continue, remember that what we're exploring is not just history, it's a living relationship. Your thoughts matter to us, so please comment below with where you're listening from and how you see the relationship between China and Japan today. And don't forget to like and subscribe so you can follow every part of this deep dive into one of history's most compelling rivalries and alliances. In the centuries following their first contact, the influence of Chinese civilization on Japan grew steadily. Japan looked to China as the model for centralized government, legal systems, and cultural sophistication. During the Asuka and Nara periods, Japanese leaders actively sent envoys to China, particularly during the Sui and Tang dynasties, to study administration, law codes, and urban planning. These missions were deliberate investments in shaping Japan's own governance and culture.
The Tang dynasty, which lasted from 618 to 907, was especially influential. It represented the height of Chinese political power and cultural achievement, and Japan was determined to absorb as much as possible from this golden age. Japanese missions brought back not only administrative ideas, but also art, poetry, architecture, and religious practices. The capital city of Heizhou-kyo, for example, was designed after the Tang capital of Chang'an, reflecting the deep architectural influence.
Confucianism was another important import. The emphasis on hierarchical relationships, loyalty, and moral governance resonated with Japan's ruling elite, who saw in it a system that could reinforce order and authority. Schools were established to teach Confucian classics, shaping the education of future leaders. Over time, these ideas blended with indigenous values, creating a uniquely Japanese approach to governance that still carried a Chinese intellectual foundation.
Buddhism's arrival had an even deeper cultural impact. Although it reached Japan through Korea, its philosophical and artistic expressions were rooted in Chinese traditions. Temples became centers of learning, housing scriptures, art, and scholars who promoted not only religious practice, but also literacy and education. Monks traveled between the two countries, serving as cultural ambassadors who carried new artistic styles, philosophical debates, and even advances in medicine.
Diplomacy in this period operated within the framework of the Chinese tributary system. While this system positioned China as the central authority, Japan used it strategically. By participating, Japan gained access to valuable trade goods, from silk and ceramics to books and rare medicines. Official recognition from China also brought prestige, but Japan maintained a careful balance, engaging in tribute without fully submitting to Chinese political control.
One notable example of early diplomacy was Prince Shotoku's correspondence with the Sui Emperor in the early 7th century. In a letter, Shotoku referred to Japan as the land where the sun rises, and China as the land where the sun sets, subtly implying equality between the two. This was a bold move, reflecting Japan's desire to engage with China as a peer rather than a subordinate, even while drawing heavily from Chinese culture.
Trade during these centuries wasn't just about luxury goods. It also carried ideas. Chinese literature, philosophy, and technology arrived alongside silk and porcelain. The Japanese calendar system, for example, was adapted from Chinese models, improving agricultural planning and state administration. Even culinary influences crossed the sea, introducing new crops and cooking methods that enriched Japanese life.
It's important to remember that these exchanges were not one-sided acts of generosity from China. They were mutually beneficial. Japan's participation in the regional order gave China another stable and cooperative partner, while Japan gained prestige and knowledge that fueled its development. In many ways, this early cooperation set a precedent for pragmatic engagement, where both sides saw tangible benefits.
Despite the overall peaceful nature of these exchanges, there were moments of tension. Japan occasionally resisted Chinese attempts to exert too much political influence, and disputes over maritime trade routes did arise. Still, in this early phase, the relationship was largely characterized by learning and adaptation, with both sides recognizing the value of maintaining diplomatic contact.
This period also saw the beginning of cultural syncretism, where elements from China were not just copied, but transformed. Japanese literature began to develop its own voice, using Chinese characters but gradually shaping them into kana scripts that reflected the sounds of the Japanese language. This innovation allowed Japan to preserve the prestige of Chinese writing while creating something uniquely suited to its own culture.
When we look at this stage of history, we can see that the rivalry between China and Japan was not yet the dominant theme. Instead, it was a time when Japan actively sought to learn from China, and China recognized Japan as a participant in the East Asian order. This mutual recognition, even if unequal in formal terms, created a foundation that would influence their relationship for centuries to come.
Yet, the seeds of future rivalry were quietly growing. Japan's adaptations of Chinese systems showed its determination to control its own destiny, while China's position as the cultural and political center of the region meant it would always expect deference. Over time, as Japan's confidence and power grew, the balance between admiration and competition would begin to shift.
For now, though, the picture is one of active cultural exchange and diplomatic engagement. Both nations were building connections that would endure, even through the storms of later centuries. The centuries of borrowing, adapting, and blending ideas formed a shared heritage, one that would both unite and divide them in the centuries to come.
And as we move forward in this story, we'll see how that shared heritage could serve as both a bridge and a battleground. The same systems and ideas that once brought them together would, in times of tension, become points of contest. Understanding this early period is crucial to making sense of the conflicts that would emerge later.
As we move into the medieval era, the nature of China-Japan relations began to shift. The centuries of steady cultural exchange did not end, but they were increasingly complicated by maritime competition and regional instability. Both nations were now more assertive in securing their own interests. This was a time when the seas between them became both a bridge for trade and a frontier for rivalry, sometimes peaceful, sometimes violent.
One of the most disruptive forces in this period was the rise of the wokou, or dwarf pirates, as they were called in Chinese records. These were not exclusively Japanese, many were actually Chinese or Korean, but Japan's fragmented political structure during its feudal wars allowed pirate bases to thrive along its coasts. From the 13th to the 16th centuries, wokou raids targeted Chinese coastal settlements and shipping, creating deep resentment in China.
The Ming Dynasty, which rose in 1368, responded to piracy by restricting private maritime trade. This policy, known as the hygiene or sea ban, aimed to control commerce through official channels, but it often pushed merchants into illegal activities. Ironically, the more China tried to clamp down on trade, the more lucrative smuggling and piracy became. Japan's samurai lords, always looking for resources to fund their own conflicts, sometimes tolerated or even encouraged these activities.
Diplomatic relations in this period were inconsistent. During peaceful stretches, official embassies were exchanged, and licensed trade flourished. Chinese silk, porcelain and books continued to flow into Japan, while Japanese silver, swords and lacquerware were highly valued in China. These official exchanges allowed both sides to benefit economically, but they were often overshadowed by the damage caused by pirate raids and maritime disputes.
The Mongol invasions of Japan in the late 13th century also left an indirect mark on China-Japan relations. At that time, China was under Mongol rule as the Yuan dynasty, and the invasions were part of a larger imperial strategy. Japan's successful defense, aided by the famous kamikaze typhoons, reinforced its sense of independence from mainland powers. Although the invasions were a failure for the Yuan, they reminded Japan that the mainland could be a source of existential threats.
By the 15th century, the Ashikaga shogunate in Japan attempted to restore formal relations with the Ming dynasty, partly to curb piracy and partly to gain the prestige of official recognition. This led to the tally trade system, where Japan was granted a limited number of trade voyages each year in exchange for acknowledging China's central position in the regional order. While it reduced some tensions, it did not end piracy completely.
The role of the East China Sea as both a trade corridor and a contested space cannot be overstated. Control over shipping routes meant control over wealth, and for a Japan increasingly engaged in internal warfare, maritime trade was a vital lifeline. For China, protecting its coasts and maintaining order in its trade networks was both an economic and political necessity. These overlapping priorities inevitably brought friction.
The technology of navigation was improving in this era, making maritime trade faster and more profitable. Larger ships could carry more goods, and the spread of the magnetic compass made long-distance voyages safer. These advancements expanded trade volumes but also made piracy more rewarding. The more wealth that moved across the sea, the more tempting it became for opportunistic raiders.
The cultural exchanges of this period were also notable, even amid the tensions. Zen Buddhism, which had taken root in Japan, maintained strong links to Chinese monasteries. Japanese monks traveled to China to study, bringing back not only religious teachings but also artistic styles, tea culture, and garden design. In this way, cultural transmission continued to flourish, even when political relations were strained.
Tea culture is a particularly interesting example. The practice of powdered tea preparation, which became central to the Japanese tea ceremony, was imported from China during this period, while Japan would later transform it into a highly ritualized art form. Its origins were in the simple monastic practices of Chinese Zen temples. This kind of exchange shows how cultural ties could survive political storms.
Yet despite these enriching exchanges, the underlying tone of the relationship was becoming more competitive. Japan's feudal lords were increasingly confident in their autonomy, while China, as the dominant regional power, expected deference. The tension between Japan's desire for independence and China's expectation of tribute created a delicate balance that could be easily upset by piracy, territorial disputes, or diplomatic missteps.
By the late medieval period, both countries had experienced significant internal changes. In China, the Ming dynasty was dealing with threats on multiple fronts, from the north and west, which sometimes reduced its focus on maritime issues. In Japan, the Sengoku period brought near constant warfare among rival daimyos, which meant foreign trade was often a tool for securing weapons and wealth. This political fragmentation made coherent foreign policy difficult.
In many ways, the medieval period set the stage for the sharper rivalries of later centuries. It was a time when the benefits of trade and cultural contact were clear, but so were the risks of conflict. The seas between China and Japan were both a highway for mutual gain and a battleground for competing ambitions. Understanding this dual nature is essential for grasping how their relationship evolved in the early modern era.
And as we will see in the next stage of our discussion, the arrival of new powers, especially from Europe, would complicate this maritime dynamic even further. The delicate balance between trade, piracy, diplomacy, and rivalry would have to contend with a whole new set of challenges as the isolationist policies of the early modern period took shape.
As the medieval tensions eased into the early modern period, the relationship between China and Japan entered a very different phase, one defined by isolation, restricted interaction, and carefully controlled trade. Both nations faced internal and external challenges that pushed them toward limiting foreign contact. Yet, even in this climate of seclusion, their relationship never disappeared. It simply changed form, adapting to the rules set by each side.
In Japan, this shift came with the Tokugawa shogunate's rise to power in 1603. After decades of civil war during the Sengoku period, the Tokugawa leaders were determined to secure stability. They introduced a strict policy known as sakoku, or closed country, which severely limited contact with the outside world. Foreigners were banned from most of Japan, and Japanese citizens were forbidden from traveling abroad. The shogunate wanted to prevent foreign influence from destabilizing the country.
China, under the Ming and later the Qing dynasty, also had its own restrictive tendencies, especially regarding maritime trade. The Ming's haijin or sea ban had already shown how cautious Chinese rulers could be about uncontrolled foreign contact. Under the Qing, the Canton system emerged in the 18th century, restricting foreign trade to a single port, Guangzhou, and limiting direct contact with outsiders. These restrictions affected how Japan could engage with China.
Despite these limitations, trade between the two nations never stopped entirely. In Japan's case, Nagasaki became the one official gateway for foreign commerce, and Chinese merchants were among the most important traders allowed to operate there. They brought silk, tea, medicinal herbs, and books, while Japan exported silver, copper, and artisanal crafts. This tightly regulated exchange allowed both countries to benefit economically without opening themselves to unwanted political influence.
Diplomatically, relations were more distant than in earlier centuries. The tribute system that had once structured interactions was no longer a major feature, especially since Japan was asserting its independence under the Tokugawa. The Chinese court still saw itself as the center of civilization, but it no longer had the same direct influence over Japan's political life. Instead, their contact became largely transactional, focused on trade and select cultural exchanges.
One fascinating aspect of this period is that even with minimal direct contact, cultural influence continued. Chinese Confucian thought, especially the Neo-Confucianism of the Song dynasty, became deeply embedded in Japanese intellectual life. Scholars in Japan studied Chinese classics and applied them to domestic governance and ethics. This shows that isolation did not mean cultural stagnation. It simply meant the channels of influence were narrower and more controlled.
Religion also remained a bridge. Buddhist sects in Japan maintained connections, albeit limited, with their counterparts in China. Some Japanese monks still traveled to Chinese monasteries, and Chinese texts continued to reach Japan through the approved trade networks. In this way, religious and philosophical traditions preserved a shared cultural space, even when political and diplomatic ties were minimal.
The economic motivations behind this limited contact were strong. Japan's mines produced large quantities of silver, which was in high demand in China for its currency system. In return, Chinese silk and porcelain were prized luxury goods in Japan. The controlled trade allowed both sides to acquire what they needed while maintaining political boundaries. It was a pragmatic arrangement. Neither side wanted to give up the benefits entirely.
However, The isolation also meant that misunderstandings and stereotypes could grow unchecked. Without regular diplomatic dialogue, each side often viewed the other through outdated information or hearsay. This could lead to misinterpretations of intentions or capabilities. By the time more direct contact resumed in later centuries, these outdated perceptions sometimes fueled tension.
Another factor shaping this era was the presence of European powers in East Asia. While both China and Japan tried to limit European influence, the reality was that the Portuguese, Dutch, and later the British were becoming major players in regional trade. Japan's policy allowed only the Dutch to operate in Nagasaki, while China managed European contact through the Canton system. These European intermediaries sometimes facilitated indirect contact between China and Japan.
The limited contact also had strategic benefits. For Japan, it avoided entanglement in the political upheavals China faced, such as the Ming-Qing transition in the 17th century. For China, it meant not having to deal directly with Japan's internal politics. Both countries could focus on their domestic priorities while still maintaining a thin but steady thread of trade and cultural exchange.
Yet this long period of isolation was not without costs. Technological advancements, particularly in military hardware and industrial production, were accelerating in Europe. By limiting their engagement with the outside world, both China and Japan were falling behind in certain fields. When Western powers arrived in greater force in the 19th century, the shock would be profound, and it would drastically change the nature of China-Japan relations.
In a sense, this isolation was like a long pause in a conversation. Neither side was entirely silent, but the depth and frequency of interaction were far less than before. The trade that did occur was enough to keep the connection alive, yet not enough to foster the kind of dynamic, adaptive relationship that had existed in earlier centuries. It was a relationship maintained in narrow corridors, not open seas.
And as we'll see in the next phase, when the doors to the outside world were forced open, both China and Japan had to make rapid adjustments. For Japan, this meant a dramatic transformation through the Meiji Restoration. For China, it meant grappling with internal decline and external pressure. These changes would propel the two nations into a new era, one where rivalry would take center stage.
The 19th century marked a turning point for both China and Japan, a period defined by rapid change and the pressing arrival of Western powers in East Asia. China, which had long viewed itself as the Middle Kingdom, suddenly found its traditional world shaken by the Opium Wars and internal rebellions. The First Opium War, beginning in 1839, exposed the Qing dynasty's military weaknesses and forced it to open treaty ports to foreign powers under unfavorable conditions. This era of unequal treaties challenged China's sovereignty and prestige.
Meanwhile, Japan was observing these events with growing concern and urgency. The arrival of Commodore Perry's American fleet in 1853 forced Japan to reconsider its centuries-old isolationist policies. Unlike China, Japan reacted quickly and decisively. The Tokugawa shogunate collapsed soon after, leading to the Meiji Restoration of 1868, a radical transformation aimed at modernizing Japan politically, militarily, and economically to resist Western domination. Japan's leaders sought to learn from Western industrial and military models, determined not to suffer China's fate.
Japan's modernization was rapid and sweeping. New technologies were imported, and industries were developed with government support. The military was reorganized along Western lines, with conscription replacing samurai armies. Education was reformed, emphasizing science and engineering. By the 1880s, Japan was emerging as a regional power capable of competing with Western imperialists. This transformation dramatically shifted the balance of power in East Asia and set the stage for future conflicts with China.
China, on the other hand, struggled to modernize. The Qing dynasty's attempts, known as the self-strengthening movement, had limited success due to conservative resistance and corruption. Military defeats, such as the loss in the Sino-French War over Vietnam and later in the First Sino-Japanese War, exposed the weaknesses of China's reforms. While reformers called for more drastic change, internal divisions and external pressures hampered meaningful progress.
The contrast between Japan's rapid modernization and China's faltering reforms created new tensions. Japan began to look beyond its borders, seeking resources and influence. Korea, a traditional Chinese tributary state, became a key arena for competition. Both nations viewed the peninsula as strategically vital, and their rivalry intensified. Japan's growing confidence clashed with China's desire to maintain its historical sphere of influence.
The opening of Japan and China's forced entry into global trade networks also brought Western powers deeper into East Asia. Britain, Russia, and others sought to expand their influence, often playing the two nations against each other. Japan skillfully navigated these dynamics, signing treaties and building alliances to strengthen its position. China found itself increasingly isolated, its sovereignty eroded by foreign concessions and territorial losses.
Economically, Japan's modernization gave it an edge. Its industrial base and efficient bureaucracy allowed it to mobilize resources quickly, supporting military expansion. Meanwhile, China's economy remained largely agrarian and decentralized. This economic disparity was critical when conflicts erupted, particularly in the 1890s. Japan's newfound strength challenged the centuries-old assumption of Chinese dominance in the region.
Cultural and ideological shifts also played a role. Nationalism surged in both countries as they faced foreign threats and internal challenges. In Japan, the idea of Fukoku Kyohei, rich country, strong army, became a guiding principle, justifying rapid industrialization and military expansion. In China, reformers and revolutionaries debated the future of the dynasty, pushing for modernization and national revival. These ideological currents fueled both cooperation and conflict.
The 19th century's final decades saw this rivalry come to a head. The question was no longer only about cultural influence or diplomacy, but about military and political control. The changes in both nations' strength and ambitions set the stage for war. This era demonstrated how external pressures from the West accelerated internal transformations, reshaping the China-Japan relationship from one of tributary diplomacy to direct competition.
Understanding this period is essential to grasp why the 20th century would witness some of the most intense conflicts between these two nations. The legacy of 19th century reforms, failures, and ambitions echoes through the political and cultural narratives of both countries even today. Their paths diverged sharply during this time, setting a foundation for rivalry that would last for generations.
The First Sino-Japanese War marked a dramatic turning point in the relationship between China and Japan, shifting the balance of power decisively toward Japan. The conflict was rooted in Korea, a peninsula long under China's influence, but increasingly desired by Japan as a strategic asset. Both nations saw Korea as vital to their security and prestige, but their competing interests soon escalated tensions into open war.
In the years leading to war, Japan had steadily expanded its influence over Korea through diplomatic pressure and covert operations. Meanwhile, China was determined to maintain its traditional role as Korea's suzerain. When a rebellion broke out in Korea, both China and Japan sent troops, each claiming to support the legitimate Korean government. This confrontation quickly spiraled beyond control, with both sides preparing for full-scale conflict.
Japan's military, modernized and well-equipped after the Meiji Restoration, proved superior to China's forces, which still relied on outdated tactics and equipment. The Japanese Navy gained control of key sea routes, cutting off Chinese reinforcements. On land, Japanese troops advanced rapidly, winning decisive battles at places like Pyongyang and the Yalu River. The war exposed the Qing dynasty's military weaknesses and administrative inefficiency.
The Treaty of Shimonoseki, signed in 1895, was a humiliating defeat for China. It forced China to recognize Korea's independence, effectively ending its centuries-old influence there. Additionally, China ceded Taiwan and the Liaodong Peninsula to Japan and agreed to pay a large indemnity. This treaty marked Japan's emergence as a major regional power and sent shockwaves through East Asia.
The war also stirred nationalist sentiments in both countries. In China, the defeat deepened dissatisfaction with the Qing dynasty and fueled calls for reform and revolution. In Japan, the victory bolstered national pride and justified continued military expansion. However, the treaty's terms also alarmed Western powers, who feared Japan's growing influence, leading to the triple intervention by Russia, Germany, and France that forced Japan to return the Liaodong Peninsula.
Despite this setback, Japan's rise was unstoppable. The war shattered the myth of Chinese invincibility and reshaped regional diplomacy. It marked the first time in modern history that an Asian power defeated a major Western-style empire, inspiring other nations under colonial threat. For China, it was a harsh lesson on the need for modernization, though reforms would prove difficult amid internal turmoil.
The First Sino-Japanese War's legacy extends beyond the battlefield. It altered perceptions of power in East Asia and accelerated Japan's imperial ambitions. The war's outcome intensified the rivalry between the two nations, setting the stage for further conflicts in the 20th century. It also highlighted how modernization and military strength had become crucial for survival in the modern world. This conflict also demonstrated the dangers of neglecting internal reforms. China's failure to modernize effectively left it vulnerable, while Japan's proactive approach gave it the upper hand. The war was not just about Korea, but symbolized the broader struggle for regional dominance. Both nations learned harsh lessons that shaped their national policies for decades to come. As we reflect on this pivotal moment, it's clear that the First Sino-Japanese War was more than a military clash. It was a turning point in the history of East Asia. It disrupted centuries-old hierarchies and challenged the traditional order. For Japan, it was the affirmation of its modernization efforts. For China, it was a call to change that would echo until the fall of the Qing dynasty.
And as we move forward in this story, we will explore how the rivalry deepened during the tumultuous years of the early 20th century, culminating in the tragedies of the Second Sino-Japanese War and World War II. The events of 1894 to 1895 laid the foundation for a century of conflict and uneasy coexistence that still influences relations today.
The early 20th century was a period of extreme upheaval for both China and Japan, as well as the entire world. After the First Sino-Japanese War, Japan rapidly increased its military and political ambitions, leading to further tensions with China. Initially, some cooperation existed, but the relationship quickly deteriorated. By the 1930s, these tensions erupted into open conflict that would become part of the wider tragedy of World War II.
Indeed, after World War I, Japan emerged as a major imperial power, expanding its influence in Asia. It took control of former German territories in China's Shandong province and Korea, which it had formally annexed in 1910. Meanwhile, China was struggling with internal divisions. Warlords controlled various regions, and the central government was weak. Japan exploited this fragmentation to increase its influence.
The 1931 Mukden incident marked a turning point. Japan staged a railway explosion as a pretext to invade Manchuria in northeastern China, establishing the puppet state of Manchukuo. This aggressive act was condemned internationally, but met with limited, effective response. The invasion deepened Chinese resentment and exposed the weaknesses of the League of Nations and other international bodies.
Following Manchuria, tensions escalated. In 1937, the Marco Polo Bridge incident triggered full-scale war between China and Japan. This conflict, often called the Second Sino-Japanese War, was brutal and devastating. Japanese forces captured key cities, including Shanghai and Nanjing. The infamous Nanjing massacre, where hundreds of thousands of civilians and prisoners of war were killed, shocked the world and left lasting scars.
During this time, China's nationalist government under Chiang Kai-shek and the Communist Party led by Mao Zedong, despite their own struggles, formed a temporary united front against Japan. The war became a national struggle for survival and identity for China. Meanwhile, Japan's military was also deeply engaged in the broader Pacific conflict as World War II expanded.
The war severely tested the relationship between China and Japan. What had once been rivalry and competition became violent occupation and resistance. Japan sought to control China and its resources, while Chinese forces, despite enormous losses, fought to defend their homeland. The war also influenced global alliances and power structures, contributing to the eventual defeat of Japan.
The years of conflict devastated much of China's infrastructure and population. Millions died or were displaced, and the social and political landscape was dramatically altered. The war weakened the nationalist government, paving the way for the communist victory in 1949. For Japan, the defeat in 1945 led to occupation demilitarization and significant political change.
Despite the horrors of war, the post-war era laid the foundation for new interactions. Both nations embarked on different paths, China as a communist state, and Japan as a pacifist democracy supported by the United States. Their relationship, marked by history, has been complex and sometimes fraught, but also characterized by economic cooperation and regional diplomacy in recent decades.
This period remains critical for understanding modern China-Japan relations. Memories of war and occupation influence political discourse and public opinion in both countries. Efforts to reconcile and build mutual trust continue, but historical wounds and nationalist sentiments often resurface, reminding us that history is never far from the present.
As we consider the legacy of the World War II era, it is clear that the rivalry-turned-conflict was devastating but also transformative. It reshaped national identities, power balances, and regional dynamics. The echoes of this era shape the politics and diplomacy of East Asia today, highlighting the importance of historical awareness in international relations.
The story of China and Japan during the early 20th century shows us how deeply history impacts the present. Understanding these painful chapters helps us appreciate the challenges and opportunities in building a peaceful future. It reminds us that alliances and rivalries are often two sides of the same coin, shaped by circumstances and choices.
Moving forward, we will explore how both nations rebuilt after the war, how economic ties developed, and how their complex history continues to influence their interactions on the world stage. The legacy of rivalry and alliance remains, shaping a relationship that is as important now as it has ever been.
After the devastation of World War II, both China and Japan faced the immense task of rebuilding their nations. Japan, under U.S. occupation, underwent sweeping reforms. The country focused on rebuilding its economy, infrastructure, and political institutions. These efforts transformed Japan into one of the world's largest economies within a few decades. Japan's rapid post-war recovery became a model for development globally.
Meanwhile, China was embroiled in a civil war that ended with the Communist Party establishing the People's Republic of China in 1949. China's early years were marked by social reforms and attempts to modernize under a communist system. However, political campaigns and economic challenges slowed growth for some time. Despite different political paths, both countries recognized the importance of economic development for national strength.
Relations between China and Japan during the early post-war years were tense and complicated. Japan's wartime actions, especially the atrocities committed during occupation, remained a source of deep resentment in China. Official diplomatic relations were not established until 1972, when Japan formally recognized the People's Republic of China. This marked the beginning of a new chapter in bilateral relations, focusing on diplomacy and trade.
Trade between the two nations grew rapidly in the following decades. Japan became one of China's largest trading partners and investors, providing capital, technology, and expertise that helped fuel China's economic reforms starting in the late 1970s. Japanese companies established factories and joint ventures in China, contributing to industrialization and job creation. This economic cooperation benefited both countries significantly.
Despite economic ties, political tensions and historical disputes occasionally strained the relationship. Issues such as textbook controversies, visits by Japanese politicians to the Yasukuni Shrine, and territorial disputes over islands in the East China Sea have provoked nationalist sentiments and diplomatic challenges. These conflicts remind us that economic cooperation does not erase historical grievances.
Cultural exchange also played a key role in rebuilding trust. Educational programs, tourism, and people-to-people interactions increased steadily. Many Chinese students studied in Japan, and Japanese popular culture found an audience in China. These softer forms of engagement helped to build mutual understanding, even when official relations were complicated.
The rapid economic growth of both countries made them key players in regional and global affairs. Their interdependence created a complex relationship characterized by both competition and cooperation. Both recognize that stability in East Asia is critical for their continued prosperity. This has led to multilateral efforts to address regional challenges such as trade, security, and environmental issues.
The story of post-war rebuilding and economic cooperation between China and Japan illustrates how former rivals can become important partners. However, it also highlights the delicate balance required to manage historical memories alongside present-day interests. The relationship is dynamic and continues to evolve in response to domestic and international factors.
Looking forward, both countries face challenges such as balancing national pride with pragmatic diplomacy, addressing security concerns, and cooperating on global issues like climate change. How they navigate these challenges will shape not only their future, but also the stability of the wider Asia-Pacific region.
This period shows us that history is not destiny. Despite a difficult past, China and Japan have demonstrated the ability to rebuild and work together. Their relationship remains one of the most important and complex in the world today. Understanding this era helps us appreciate both the potential and the challenges of their ongoing partnership.
In the 21st century, China and Japan continue to be two of Asia's most influential powers, but their relationship remains complicated by historical grievances and strategic competition. While economic ties have grown, issues like territorial disputes and military expansion create tensions that impact regional security and international relations.
One of the most contentious issues is the dispute over the Senkaku Islands, known as the Diaoyu Islands in China. These uninhabited islands in the East China Sea are strategically located and rich in potential resources. Both countries claim sovereignty, leading to frequent diplomatic protests and military patrols. This territorial conflict is a flashpoint that risks escalating tensions.
Militarily, China has significantly expanded its naval capabilities, aiming to secure its maritime interests. Japan, under its pacifist constitution, maintains a self-defense force but has been increasing its defense budget and strengthening alliances, especially with the United States. Both nations watch each other closely, aware that regional dominance could hinge on military strength.
Nationalism plays a strong role in shaping public opinion and government policies in both countries. Historical education, media portrayals, and political rhetoric sometimes exacerbate distrust. Efforts to promote reconciliation often face setbacks when nationalist sentiments flare, making diplomacy more challenging.
Despite these challenges, there are also areas of cooperation. Both nations participate in regional forums like the East Asia Summit and APEC, working together on economic integration, disaster relief, and environmental protection. Multilateral engagement offers a platform to manage competition and build confidence.
The role of the United States as a security partner for Japan and a competitor to China adds another layer of complexity. Japan relies heavily on its alliance with the US for security guarantees, while China views American military presence in the region with suspicion. This triangular dynamic influences how China and Japan approach their bilateral relationship.
Cybersecurity and technological competition also define modern rivalry. Both countries invest heavily in innovation, digital infrastructure, and artificial intelligence. Cooperation in technology is limited, as concerns about espionage and intellectual property persist.
The economic relationship remains strong but vulnerable. Trade disputes and supply chain dependencies create both opportunities and risks. The COVID-19 pandemic highlighted the interconnectedness of their economies, as well as the fragility of global supply chains.
Looking ahead, the challenge for China and Japan is to manage competition without letting rivalry escalate into conflict. Building trust through dialogue, cultural exchange, and crisis management mechanisms is vital for regional peace.
Understanding the history of their relationship, of rivalry, alliance, conflict, and cooperation, is essential for appreciating the complexities they face today. The lessons of the past can guide them toward a future where coexistence and collaboration are possible despite their differences.
While much of our discussion has focused on rivalry and conflict, it's important to remember the deep cultural connections between China and Japan. Despite political tensions, the two countries share centuries of influence in art, literature, religion, and philosophy. These cultural ties continue to shape their interactions today and offer pathways toward mutual understanding.
Absolutely, Adam. Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoism all played significant roles in both societies. For instance, Japanese Zen Buddhism has roots in Chinese Chan traditions. Moreover, the exchange of poetry, calligraphy, and painting techniques enriched the artistic heritage of both countries. This shared cultural heritage forms a bridge that transcends political divides.
In modern times, cultural diplomacy has become a vital tool. Festivals, exhibitions, and academic exchanges promote awareness of each other's culture and history. These initiatives help counterbalance negative perceptions caused by political disputes and build grassroots goodwill among the peoples of China and Japan.
Soft power also extends to popular culture. Japanese anime, manga, and fashion have a substantial following in China. Similarly, Chinese cinema, cuisine, and traditional medicine have found audiences in Japan. This mutual cultural interest fosters people-to-people connections and helps soften nationalistic sentiments.
Education plays a key role too. Many Chinese students study in Japan and vice versa, learning language and cultural nuances firsthand. These educational exchanges build future generations with a more nuanced understanding of their neighbor, encouraging dialogue rather than confrontation.
Economic cooperation is increasingly intertwined with cultural exchange. Tourism between China and Japan has grown significantly, with millions traveling each year to explore historical sites, natural beauty, and modern cities. This interaction nurtures appreciation and curiosity beyond politics.
As we reach the conclusion of our discussion on the history of China and Japan's rivalry and alliance, it's important to consider what the future might hold for these two powerful neighbors. Their shared history is complex, filled with moments of both cooperation and conflict which continue to influence their relationship today. Looking ahead, the prospects are shaped by many factors: economic ties, geopolitical competition, historical memory, and the broader international environment.
Absolutely, Adam. The deep economic interdependence between China and Japan remains a key foundation that could promote stability. Despite political tensions, trade between the two nations continues to thrive. China is Japan's largest trading partner, and Japan remains one of China's top sources of investment and technology. These economic links create strong incentives for both countries to avoid open conflict and seek cooperative solutions.
However, economic cooperation alone cannot smooth over all difficulties. Historical issues, especially those related to wartime memories, continue to cause friction. Disputes over textbooks, official visits to war shrines, and differing narratives about past events evoke strong nationalist feelings on both sides. How each nation addresses these issues, whether through dialogue, education, or political gestures, will play a major role in shaping public opinion and bilateral relations.
Geopolitical dynamics are also critical. Both China and Japan are regional powers with expanding ambitions. China's growing military presence and assertiveness in the South and East China Seas raise concerns in Japan and among other regional countries. Japan's alliance with the United States is a strategic counterbalance, but it also contributes to tensions. Navigating this competition without escalating conflicts requires careful diplomacy and crisis management.
Another factor is the evolving regional order. The Asia-Pacific is becoming more multipolar, with emerging powers and shifting alliances. Both China and Japan participate in various regional forums aimed at fostering cooperation on issues like trade, environmental protection, and disaster response. Expanding multilateral engagement could provide pathways to manage differences and build trust.
Technology and innovation will also influence their future relationship. Both nations invest heavily in cutting-edge fields like artificial intelligence, renewable energy, and digital infrastructure. While competition in technology can be fierce, there are opportunities for collaboration in addressing global challenges such as climate change and pandemics. Joint efforts in these areas could help ease tensions.
People-to-people connections matter too. Tourism, educational exchanges, and cultural programs build understanding beyond government relations. These interactions create a human dimension that can soften nationalistic rhetoric and foster goodwill. Promoting these exchanges is an important part of building a peaceful future.
Looking further ahead, how China and Japan manage their rivalry and cooperation will affect not only their own futures, but also the broader region and the world. Their ability to balance national interests with global responsibilities will be tested by challenges like economic shifts, security threats, and environmental crises. The lessons from their shared history remind us that peace and partnership require effort, empathy, and sometimes compromise.
To sum up, the future of China-Japan relations is neither predetermined nor fixed. It is a dynamic process influenced by many internal and external factors. Recognizing their intertwined past, both painful and productive, provides context for navigating present challenges. With careful diplomacy, mutual respect, and a focus on common interests, these two nations can build a relationship that contributes to regional stability and prosperity.
Thank you for joining us on this journey through the history of China and Japan's rivalry and alliance. Understanding this complex relationship is key to appreciating East Asia's past, present, and future. We hope today's discussion has provided valuable insights and sparked your interest in learning more about the dynamics shaping this important region.